So let's talk about these perspective shifts. I'm going to be referencing a script that I wrote, mostly because I've tried to record this video multiple times and I tend to go into a lot of caveats and little tangents and stuff. I'm just going to try and get through the script just as written for now. I wanted to talk about these perspective shifts that I've had about these three filmmaking topics: film versus digital, practical effects versus CGI, and story structure versus no structure. And I put these three together because I had a similar journey with them where by the end my taste wasn't in a wildly different place. I just gained a level of context that sort of does away with these frameworks to begin with. So as a preface, I'll go into each of these topics a little bit, but I'm not going to try and prove my perspectives as much as just explain how I see things now. And there's a lot of information in books and blogs and videos that help me form these opinions. So basically I'll just link to as many of these things as I can in the description. So the first notion is film versus digital. And the major perspective shift I had here was that these are not comparing similar things. They're both capture mediums, but film is a capture medium and a process that has been developed over many years. With digital, especially early on, the process was just being developed, and each manufacturer had their color science and their standard transformations, but there wasn't much consistency to what you could even say the look of digital was. It was not a representation of what digital cameras were, but just one possible interpretation. And to some extent, it's largely the same now. In comparison, while there is lots of variety with film, Kodak and Fuji scientists have developed both shooting and print film stocks for years, honing in on pleasing color relationships, and the development of film goes alongside the development of movies as an art form, and in a broader sense, visual arts in general. So it's understandable that film would have an aesthetic advantage over digital, at least initially. I think because of the limited digital processes early on, the assumption was that digital could not look like film, but people like Steve Yedlin have shown how that's not the case. If we want to match the look of film, we can take an evidence-based approach to cataloging the characteristics of film and develop a process to match those characteristics. The more rigorous the methods, the better and less approximate results we'll get. So now digital can look like film in either an approximate or highly accurate way. And incidentally, film can also be made to look like digital. To me, digital is just part of the continuum of visual exploration as artists and humans. If you believe that the image pipeline is more of a deciding factor than the camera, and you feel like you could do anything, then the focus becomes, what do you want things to look like? Which for me has been really empowering and made me want to get better in touch with my own taste. I love the look of film, but which shooting and print stocks specifically, and in what lighting conditions? I've been really inspired by animation and photography and graphic design, and I've been slowly growing my physical and digital reference materials. I can kind of both absorb them subconsciously, but also choose to make empirical observations if I want to recreate specific aspects directly. At this point with this topic, I don't believe in this binary. I believe that film and digital cameras are both tools, and I know that if I want to make either look a specific way, there's enough information out there for me to create a look that I'm after. For my personal work, I'm using a mix of different tools. I do like film emulation, and I want to learn how to do it better and how to test tools better. I'm not perfectly satisfied with where I'm at, but I also know that there's a lot more to learn still, and I haven't hit the limit of what's possible to do with the tools I already have or the tools that I'm aware of. Okay, so moving on to practical effects versus CGI. This perspective shift is also twofold. One is understanding the history of visual effects and how filmmakers were always trying to innovate, and there hasn't been a point in time where people stopped and locked off the techniques involved in visual effects. And then the second aspect is that both can look either good or bad depending on the context and the specific taste employed in utilizing these tools. Like the film versus digital topic, the perspective shift is in acknowledging that this binary doesn't actually make sense. I like the look of practical effects, and there's an aesthetic look to practically photographed elements, but those characteristics can be quantified and recreated digitally. Doing so accurately obviously takes time and an attention to detail that's not always afforded to visual effects artists, but in some cases does happen. But those effects that truly go unnoticed don't get added to the debate or this perspective of practical versus CGI. The other side of this is that practical effects can look terrible and distracting and unrealistic, all the same criticisms that get leveled at CGI. And additional nuances include that recognizing CGI as a category is largely meaningless. There are thousands of unique positions and no processes that truly happen by a computer on their own. Even automated ones need to be set up. Effects artists vary greatly and can employ all the same talents associated with traditional fine artists. Again, I think it comes down to taste. Like, are we objecting to things looking unrealistic, or are we objecting to things feeling out of place and distracting? I would argue the latter. The use of practical or digital effects doesn't automatically guarantee that your effects will come out one way or the other. You can prefer a practical photographed aesthetic and use either practical or digital means to achieve it. You can also have any other taste and use practical, digital, or a combination of both to achieve them. The argument is basically that we favor well done visual effects that feel in harmony with the film. And similarly to the film versus digital debate, the actual focus is the same one that visual artists have always had, which is what do we want things to look like and how do we want to get there? So story structure versus no structure. To me, this topic feels a little more complicated and has more caveats, but the basic premise of removing this binary framework is the same. I started from a place of being highly skeptical of structure, then later feeling like I hadn't given it a fair shot, so I dove into learning it for years as much as I could. And when you study screenplay film structure, the assertion is that this is the scientific or humanistic structure of how we tell stories. And most of the film structure books make some reference to Freytag's pyramid, the dramatic arc, character change arc, the hero's journey, and that this suggested structure is just the summation of how people think and tell stories in general across cultures and demographics. My perspective shift came in acknowledging that the traditional film structure was simply one idea of structure, granted with many splintering versions, but that there are many expressions of structure with entirely different conceptions around them. Different conceptions of structure get into different philosophical approaches, as well as just different expressions of process. There are more specific critiques I have and have been made about conceptualizing storytelling as conflict, centering individuals over community, and predetermination in storytelling, basing everything off of a central dramatic argument, for instance. And I've found alternative structures and processes that have answered those concerns for me, and also just provided a reminder that there are countless possibilities. The reality is that structure is not the end product of the art form, films are, and because of that, any process that results in a film is on a similar level of comparison with any notions of writing or structure, which again speaks to a similar point as the other two topics, where it becomes about what are you doing? What does the project call for, and what is your taste? Not just in the work, but also your process and working habits. Some recent structural and writing concepts that I've enjoyed are Hayao Miyazaki's image first process, letting his subconscious guide him, which I feel like shares similarities with this screenwriter educator Linda Barcy's conception of daydreaming as writing, as well as the director of Portrait of a Lady on Fire, her notions about desire when she talked about developing that movie. But more than any one option, I like the idea of building a structure or process that feels right for the particular film. As with dispelling the other binaries, it's more about seeing additional possibilities than declaring a winner. The traditional film structure can be incredibly effective, and when it's working, there's a harmony between the structure and the filmmaking that feels invisible. Any approach could yield good or bad results, it's just a matter of what you like and how you want to approach things. In a way, these feel like very obvious conclusions to come to on these topics. And in many cases, even when we know better technically, philosophically, it's easy to understand what people tend to mean when they say film looks better than digital or practical looks better than CGI. But I think conceptualizing these topics with more nuance and context actually leads to greater appreciation of film as an art form, especially for filmmakers. Those are my thoughts about these topics. I'll probably go into like more specifics in future videos, but yeah, that's it for now.